First, it really depends on what we mean by the word capitalism. And it's a word that is very loaded. We use it to mean all kinds of different things. So sometimes people use the word capitalism to sort of lump together a whole bunch of different things. Sometimes everything that they think is bad about the world gets lumped into capitalism. So in some ways, first, I think it's important to try and disaggregate a little bit what we mean by that. So, and part of my work, part of the work of the Community Economies Collective is to try and unpack that word and to actually think about some of the ways that how we've thought about capitalism has a great influence on how we think about social transformation. So the kinds of critiques we make about capitalism really matter in terms of political possibility. So I really want to challenge notions of capitalism that would lump together all kinds of different phenomena into one big package that would be called, say, the capitalist system, where capitalism is seen as the name of the whole economy. The kind of way where somebody would be able to talk about the US or Canada as capitalist countries. And so there, it seems like, we would say, money, wherever you find money, that's capitalism. Wherever you find markets, that's capitalism. Wherever there's business, that's capitalism. Wherever there's surplus being generated, that must be capitalism. So for me, it's important to say we can have money without capitalism. Money pre-existed capitalism. It's articulated in lots of different forms of exchange. We can have markets without capitalism. Markets also pre-existed capitalism. We can have business without capitalism, investment without capitalism, surplus without capitalism. But you can't have capitalism without any of those things. So it sort of works in one direction but not the other. I want to think of capitalism not as a single unified system that we're inside of, or as a giant monster that's captured us entirely. Because that image then implies that the only way out of it is a sort of singular giant revolution where we overthrow the whole system and then we impose the new system. And we get in this project of what's the next system going to be? And somebody's got to sort of imagine this huge thing that's built sort of prefabricated, and then I suppose it's imposed. I'm not exactly sure how we then implement it, right? So for me, it's really important that we think of capitalism in a way that acknowledges its power, but also acknowledges its limitations. So I like to think of capitalism as a process rather than as a thing. And specifically, I would say it's a process of addictive, accumulative colonialism. So lots of words there, but in the sense that it's a particular way of linking together money and markets and the organization of living labor into a form of exploitative wage labor, the production of commodities. It's a way of linking together these processes that sets in motion a kind of addictive process that has to continually accumulate in order to survive. And that necessity to accumulate functions as a form of colonization, where that capitalist process is constantly trying to figure out a new way to accumulate, a new way to try and make sure that process of accumulation survives and is sustained. And it's inseparable from colonialism proper, right? I mean, historically, it's impossible to entangle the kind of colonialism that invaded a huge portion of the world in the name of accumulation, enslaving people, stealing land, from inventing race as a way of justifying all of that. It's impossible to separate that from the actual process of colonization that is capitalism itself. So I want to be able to think that we are subjected to this process of ongoing colonization in the name of profit. And the addiction part is important too, because there's some aspect of capitalism that functions like a social disease. And it's that part that is drawing people up into the addictive necessity to continue to perpetuate this. I mean, this question of why do people end up becoming capitalists? And there's got to be some piece there that is at least analogous, if not actually like a drug, where once you get in on it, you can't stop. And you have to keep on getting your fix. And the thing is, the necessity to get that fix draws us up into it. It generates dependencies where, because of that colonial process, communities are constantly, I mean, as a condition of possibility for capitalism, we're robbed of the ability to provide for ourselves, right? That's the process of enclosure, the process of privatization for the sake of accumulation. So this is part of the colonial process, and we become dependent then on the things that capitalism is selling, and we become dependent on the wages that capitalism is offering. So I think it's very important that we have an analysis of the power of that process. And it's also very important that we think of it as a process. And like all colonial processes, it is incomplete. Right? There's no project of colonization that ever fully succeeds in conquering the territory. I mean, there's always resistance, there's always a remainder, there's always something that escapes that process. And so for me, and I think for others in the Community Economies Collective, this Community Economies perspective is very much about trying to amplify and highlight that which escapes. So it's about seeing capitalism not just as a strong, powerful thing that is colonizing and conquering, but also seeing the ways in which capitalism is continually failing to colonize and conquer. And so how do we identify those failures, which are actually the successes of our communities to resist and to live on our own, to provide for ourselves? So the enclosures aren't complete. We actually survive by all kinds of non-capitalist relations and processes. And so, I mean, in a way, then, capitalism is actually a kind of parasite. You know, this is really in some ways a Marxian analysis, that capitalism is a parasite on all of these other non-capitalist living processes. It requires them in order for its own survival. And so, you know, we could say, well, if capitalism requires all these non-capitalist practices of cooperation, then therefore they're all part of capitalism. But for me, it's very important that we flip that story, because if we tell the story that all of our practices of cooperation are really just helping capitalism survive, that, for example, unpaid household labor, which constitutes a huge portion of the livelihood practice of humans, even in the most industrialized societies. If we say, well, all of that is just supporting capital, it's making wage labor possible, that may be true to some extent, but that also devalues, I think, the sense in which that work is actually not capitalism. And so there's a flipping of the story that starts to validate that work as being something that's actually different than capitalism. And it lets us tell the story that capitalism hasn't fully taken over all the space, which means that we can start to recognize where are the places where we have forms of non-capitalist power that we're already building in our communities, that we're already relying on. Where if capitalism as a colonial process falls apart and disappears, we're still able to survive, we're still able to make livings, even if in a struggling way. But there's power there, right? And we have to figure out how to organize from that place of power.